Good evening. I'm Priya Natarajan. I happen to be the current director of the Frankie program in Science and Humanities. I'm delighted to see you all here for the Frankie Distinguished Speaker Series, in which we have featured leading thinkers whose work and intellectual influence transcends traditional disciplinary boundaries. First, I would like to thank our generous donors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Frankie, Richard and Barbara, who are here in the audience. Thank you so much for not just endowing the series, but also being here with us and participating actively in the activities that we've been organizing. So second, after the talk, I want to mention we have a very nice reception downstairs in room 108. And I wanted to remind you that we would really like to invite you to continue the conversation there. And there's some really nice food, as well as alcohol. Okay, and then I'm required to give you this notice before I get on to today's program, that the event is actually being recorded and photographed for educational, archival, and promotional purposes, including use in print or the internet and other forms of media. By attending this event today, you agree to the possibility of your voice or perhaps your likeness captured by these means and used only for such purposes without compensation to you, and hereby waive any related right of privacy or publicity. Now that I'm done with the recording formalities, this brings us to our speaker this evening, Professor Gary Tomlinson, who is a true transdisciplinarian scholar. He serves as the current director of the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. And Tomlinson is a musicologist with a long commitment to multidisciplinary exploration. And his teaching, lecturing, and scholarship span and reflect this broad intellectual diversity. Central among the various strong research interests of his have been the traditions of European classical music, including the history of opera and early modern musical thought and practice. But his work has always opened up to broader visions and perspectives, the social context in which music making happens. And he has produced many wonderful essays and books on music of the indigenous American societies, jazz, cultural and anthropological theory, and the philosophy of history. His recent book is titled Culture and the Course of Human Evolution. And I think in this book, he offers a very intriguing and compelling expanded view of our human origin story. So this latest project is part of work that he has been doing over the past couple of years, intersecting with archaeology and evolutionary biology, looking at the role of musical capacities in the emergence of modern humanity. He has several other books that which include, maybe I'll list a couple, it's a long list, include Monteverdi and the End of the Renaissance, Music in the Renaissance Magic, and so on. He's also looked at indigenous voice in the era of European contact and music and historical critique. He's also, many of you, like I did, might have known of him well. I knew of him well before I met him because of his music appreciation textbook called Listen, which I encountered when I was an undergraduate at MIT. Wow. It's now in its 7th edition. So Tomlinson was awarded a BA from Dartmouth College and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He arrived at Yale in 2010 after several years as the Distinguished Annenberg Professor in the Humanities at UPenn. He served as a Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar and has had many, many prizes from the American Musicological Society, the British Academy. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and recipient of Guggenheim and the MacArthur Fellowship. So it goes on and on. So, but without much further ado, because I'm very impatient to hear what he has to say, his talk today is titled The Third Algorithm, The Evolution of Human Culture. Gary, it's a real privilege to have you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Truly, thank you all for being here. It's a moist day, and many of you are eager to go home and find out what a complete exoneration looks like up close and personal. And I want to thank Priya for the invitation to speak under the auspices of the wonderful Frankie program in Science and Humanities. And of course, I too I never tire of thanking Rich and Barbara for all of their extraordinary support over the years, not only for this program, but for many other programs at the Whitney and many other programs at Yale in general. So, the third algorithm. This is, as Priya has already said, I somewhat immodestly put up covers of a couple of recent books. This is an extension of, the talk today is an extension of these recent studies. The first of them, A Million Years of Music, was an attempt to understand how it is that humans came, what the evolutionary dynamic was by which humans came to be musicking creatures. There was a model of cultural evolutionary dynamic that was mooted there that I wanted to explore more, and that's what happened in culture in the course of human evolution. And it is there's no bottom to this question. I go on exploring it, and some further exploration is what I will be talking about today. The algorithm referred to in my title, I will get to the third. I have to get to the first and second first, however. The algorithm in my title, what I mean by an algorithm in this case is indeed a set of conditions. I don't quite mean, the Google and Amazon things that are controlling all our lives, but rather a set of conditions that set processes in motion, basically. And the first and foremost algorithm in evolutionary thinking, as you all know, is Darwin's natural selection. Here's the algorithm. If you have a group of organisms, a population of organisms that passes along traits to successive generations, that is to say, there is inheritance, and you have in that inheritance, there is some variation of those traits from generation to generation, and all of this is happening in a landscape of not unlimited resources, there will be selection. The process is set in motion by those conditions alone. I'm not going to read quotations from a lot of my slides today, but I do want to read these wonderful words from the beginning of chapter 4 in On the Origin of Species. Can it be thought improbable that variation is useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations? If such do occur, can we doubt, remembering that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive, that individuals, having any advantage, however slight, over others, would have the best chance of surviving and procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. Now, Darwin, in his model of natural selection, builds the question of resources into it. You can see that in this quotation, in the reference to the many more individuals that are born than can possibly survive, or the complex battle of life. And indeed, his model for thinking about population dynamics in the first place was Malthus's model. Thomas Malthus from around 1800. The Malthusian model is, as most of you are familiar with, is absolutely bound up with the waxing and waning of resources. But when we take seriously this question of resources, we need to move beyond natural selection to a second algorithm that has always been present. We can see it implicitly in Darwin's model, has always been present in evolutionary thinking since Darwin, but has in recent decades burgeoned into primary importance in evolutionary thinking. And this second algorithm is the algorithm of niche construction. Niche construction. This now is a feedback loop, a feedback cycle between the environment and the organisms. The top of the feedback cycle here is essentially Darwin's natural selection. The environment exerts, as the metaphor usually has it, exerts a selective pressure on organisms living in it. Some variants of those, some variants are selected for, other variants are selected against because of the nature of the affordances and constraints that the environment offers. The other side of this feedback loop, however, is what niche construction wants to focus on, and that is the fact that organisms change their environments in living in them. That there are no organisms anywhere in the history of life, here or anywhere else, wherever life may be, that could possibly be so light-footed that they would have no impact whatsoever on their environments. If they do have impacts on their environments, however, we need to take account of that in our model of natural selection, because the selective gradient, the selective terrain of the environment is not only changing the genomes of these organisms through many, many generations, but the organisms in their behaviors, in their life ways, are changing the environment. So the environment is changing the organisms and vice versa. Now, if we were to leap ahead to talk about cultural organisms, cultural animals, that is, animals that have cultural behaviors, we would immediately understand that in order to think about niche construction of cultural animals, we're going to have to think about the role of culture in changing the environment, right? Culture is, the cultures of animals are not simply neutral, they are part of their niche construction. So the question of how these cultures change their niches, change the nature of the construction, is one that we will have to build into our feedback cycle of niche construction. Now, I've gotten ahead of myself because I haven't yet said what I think culture might be. Here's a definition of culture from, that evolutionists have taken up for about the last 30 years or so in trying to understand the dynamics of the dynamics of culture as it plays a part in evolutionary process. There it is, Pete Richardson and Robert Boyd. Information learned and transmitted from one generation to another through teaching, imitation, and similar means. The crucial elements of this are the learning of information, the transmitting of information through some sort of imitative or pedagogical means. Now, this is a hugely broad view of culture. It's a view of culture that is certainly broad enough to open out our notion of cultural animals well beyond Homo sapiens in the world today. We can think of songbird cultures. We can think of humpback whale cultures. We can think of sperm whale cultures, by the way. This was only recently really made clear, but the click codes by which that are learned and transmitted from generation to generation are rather complex codes by which whales not only identify their pods, but they also identify individuals within their pods. Whale cultures, in other words. We can think of course, a number of non-human primates in the world today that have cultures, according to this broad definition: chimpanzees, bonobos, maybe gorillas, some other monkeys even, beyond the great apes. So it's a broad view of culture is the first point. The second point, before I move on from this, is that we need to think a little bit more broadly about the information that is at stake here. We can think first. There is a particular kind of information that I want to get to. That is the information that is embodied in culture, the information that is learned and transmitted in culture. It plays a role in it is an outgrowth of a much broader kind of information, a much more broader foundation, informational foundation. This broad informational foundation is we can think of as operative correspondences that are evolved into living things. Think of the relationship between the correspondences between a messenger RNA molecule and a DNA molecule, or the correspondences between a messenger RNA molecule with its codons and the amino acids that bond to those codons, making up polypeptides, proteins, finally. These are all informational processes. In any useful definition of information that has come along since the 1940s, these would be considered informational processes. But the information in culture is of a different sort. The information in culture is information about. It is information about the niche. It is information about the sociality of animals on the niche. It is the information about how it is that they move forward in constructing their niche. The question then comes to be, how did this difference in kinds of information come along? How did aboutness arise? And that takes us to the third algorithm. The third algorithm is sign making, or semiosis. Semiosis is a special animal interaction with the world, and it creates a very distinctive kind of information processing in its complexity. And I've laid out a little chart here that gives you a starting point, as I see it, for semiosis. Again, this is the view of semiosis that is going to be, like culture, is going to be broadly dispersed across many animals. Many more animals, in fact, are semiotic than finally are cultural animals in this view. Where do we start? We start with the notion of an attentive animal, the notion of an animal that can pay attention to things. This is not true of all animals. It's certainly not true of plants, microbes, and other and molecules themselves. But the notion of attention has been much researched recently by people from many different fields. They take in the notion of top-down processing from complex central nervous functions such as memory, learning, even rudimentary memory and rudimentary learning. They take into account also the filtering of the sensory stimuli that come to the animal from the outside world. They take all of those things into account, but what all of these views of semios, all of these views of attention agree on whatever their other differences, is that attention is first of all a capacity to winnow or to focus or to focus on certain stimuli from among all of those stimuli that are impinging on the animal at any given moment. This notion of a winnowing or a focusing is something that then enables animals to bring into salience certain stimuli while not attending quite so much to other stimuli. Right? And not only that, because it brings them into salience, in conjunction with these top-down neural systems, it enables the easier memorization of them, it enables learning about these stimuli, it enables many things. But there's one thing that these attention researchers don't quite pick out as often as I think they might, and that is the recursive quality to attention. If you have an animal that is able to winnow from among all the stimuli impinging on it just a set of stimuli and pay attention to those, well, we can recursively see that animal, given whatever the limit, within the limits of its sensorium and its cognitive patterns, that animal might be able to winnow further and pay attention to a smaller number of stimuli within the great group of stimuli that it might otherwise have paid attention to. This opens up something that is, to me, immensely important. It opens up the possibility of attending not only to things as in their wholes, but attending to aspects or qualities or traits of things in very particular ways. And this opens up the possibility then of a part-for-whole association whereby an animal could focus, could attend to one aspect of something, and that aspect of the something, of whatever it was, could refer to the whole something, even though it was a single aspect of it. What I'm describing here is, of course, a rudimentary sign. It is semiosis in action. What comes about at this moment is that the quality or the aspect of the broader set of stimuli that is being focused on can come to refer to that broader set. It can come to mean that broader set. It can come to be about that broader set. Here's an instance. Here's our European robin back again. This is a very intelligent animal, able to attend in all kinds of complex ways to the world around it. It has been fed during its childhood by, say, regurgitated food from its parents, but it has also attended to the fact that its parents eat red berries. It has attended to this. But by this recursive principle that I've been talking about, it can also attend to qualities of those berries, individual qualities. It doesn't have to take on every aspect of the berries to know that those berries might be something it might eat. It doesn't have to take on the relationship of the berries to the leaves or the branches on which they grow. It doesn't have to take on many things, but it might take on just a single quality of them, say the redness of the berries, right? Once it does that, once it makes a part-for-whole association between the redness and the berries as a whole, it has created a simple sign of the berry, a sign of what it eats. Redness then can connote, can mean, can refer to what it eats. A sign and its object. Now, this is a very simple kind of sign. It is, in fact, what Charles Sanders Peirce famously called an icon. It is the simplest kind of sign, but it is a simple sign, a foundation from which a hierarchy of more and more complex signs will be built. So here's another instance of an icon. An icon then for Peirce, for me as well, for Terence Deacon, who's referred to in this slide, who is a neo-Peircean of the first order, who has done all kinds of analysis of Peircean semiosis. An icon is a sign that bears a qualitative resemblance to its object. In this case, we have a painting of a woolly mammoth on a cave wall. It's Peshmerel in southern France. This refers to the woolly mammoth itself, to the real thing. It refers to the real thing by virtue of only certain aspects of that real thing. The outline of its body shape is what it uses. It doesn't require the color of the wool on the mammoth to be a part of the sign. It doesn't require the color of the tusks. It doesn't require any other facts about the mammoth to be involved in order to become an icon of the mammoth, because it picks out one qualitative resemblance and associates that with the whole thing. The next more complex kind of sign, and it rises in complexity in part because animals come along whose central nervous systems enable them to construct this greater complexity, especially in their capacities for learning and memory, is what Peirce called the index. And this is a sign that strikes up a pointing, an indicating, relation with its object, a causal relation, or just a relationship of proximity in some cases. The most famous index of all is smoke as an index of fire. How does an index come about in the cognizance of an animal? Well, it has to depend, first of all, on some earlier learning that smoke and fire were associated. So it is going to depend already on some kind of learning capacity, fairly complicated learning capacity, some kind of well-developed memory, not just a transient working memory, but some kind of episodic memory that can remember episodes from early in the animal's life. But once an animal has this, it can then strike up a relationship between a present experience, where there's smoke only, no fire that has been perceived yet, and fire, and an earlier experience where that was a complete experience of smoke experienced with fire. It can put these two things together. But notice that in putting these two things together, it has constructed not only an indexical sign, but it has also depended on iconicity. It has depended on the way icons work, because the present day incomplete experience is made complete by making it an icon of an earlier remembered experience, right? There's a qualitative likeness of these two things. An index, smoke as referring to, meaning fire. The most complex kind of symbol, most complex kind of sign for purse was the symbol. This is a kind of sign that in the world today, to all our evidence, there are no animals that make symbols except for Homo sapiens. In an earlier world, there may have been some other hominins that made symbols, Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis. The Neanderthals are the best candidate for that, though it's a very vexed question as to whether they were symbolic creatures or not. A symbol is a sign that relies on a systematic relationship in a group of symbols in order, that is somehow governed by rules, by conventions, in order to come to its signifying function. It doesn't signify except once it becomes a part of some sort of organized system of signs. Now, the most pervasive and most foundational and most important kind of symbolism that modern humans all practice is language. And it is a hugely developed kind of and interesting kind of symbolism. But the words in a language point to one another. They point to one another in all kinds of ways. Adverbs point to verbs, verbs point to nouns, pronouns point to nouns, or they might point to whole groups of other words. They can point in all kinds of interesting ways. All kinds of words are busy pointing to other words. This, by the way, this pointing reminds us of the index, and we're going to find that the symbol, just as the index was based on the icon for its structure, the symbol is based on the index for its structure. So first of all, we have indexical relationships, pointing relationships among all the signs in a system of signs that will become symbols. But by virtue of this pointing relationship, these indexical relationships, the whole system then comes to be able to point beyond itself, for example, to the world, as language can point to the world. So we've got two orders of indexicality here. The indexicality that governs the relationships within the system, the indexicality that then enables that governed system, that rule-bound system, to point beyond itself to the world at large. Here we've reached the apex of the complexity of signs, and perhaps we will step back and just have a quick review. We start from a foundation of information. Think of those messenger RNA molecules and DNA molecules. Semiosis grows out of a broader realm of information when, in fact, central nervous systems come along that are complex enough to start performing some of the functions that I was just describing. Sorry, wrong direction. Culture, then, is a semiotic enterprise through and through. It is about signs and their aboutness. It takes as its stuff signs and their aboutness. And finally, in the most complex kinds of signs, the symbol, for example, we see another possibility within culture, that is to say, complex cultural systems, systematic culture of one sort or another. And we see also, then to just review again, information is about operative correspondence, evolved operative correspondence. Semiosis is about aboutness, and that's where meaning comes into this. Culture is about learning and transmission. And then we finally get to the most complex kind of cultures, systematic cultures. So let's now turn to, am I still going backwards? I don't know. There, I'm going forward. Let's now turn to some Paleolithic cultural systems and think about how they are semiotic and how they work. Here's an Acheulean hand axe, an Acheulean biface. This one from about 700,000 years ago. It is a thing of beauty to those of us who, by the way, those of us who have tried to make one. Boy, is it hard. And this is 700,000 years ago. I don't even come close to Neanderthals. But in any case, this technology, in order to make such a biface, by the way, this technology was already emerged about 1¾ million years ago. Homo sapiens emerged between 300 and 200,000 years ago. This is a hugely ancient technology practiced by many different hominin species, right? It goes way, way back. In order to make one of these, you take a cobble, you take a core, and you take a hammerstone, and you start chipping away at the cobble. When you chip away at the cobble, as anybody who has tried this immediately learns, when you chip, you cannot take a cobble and say, I know how an Acheulean hand axe is going to come out of this. All you can do is chip away at the cobble, and a flake is chipped off. And that flaking of the chip then forms an index pointing you to the next gesture. And that forms an index pointing you to the next gesture, and an index pointing you to the next gesture. At every moment, you are concatenating signs, indexes, from one gesture to the next that help you finally, if you're pretty good at it, get to something as beautifully symmetrical as this hand axe is. This is then a pretty complex array of indexes that enables this cultural system to be passed along and to be taught and transmitted from generation to generation. But notice that it's just a kind of a willy-nilly sequence of indexes. It is not a sequence of indexes that is somehow prearranged, that is somehow hierarchical, that is organized in more than a very, very rudimentary manner. If we look at a later stone technology, Levallois point making, this now is a stone technology that came into existence, the debates rage, somewhere between 300 and 400,000 years ago, maybe, somewhere on that time scale at any rate. It has been studied to a fairly well in association with Neanderthals. It's also been studied a lot recently in association with our forebears in Africa, Neanderthals, of course, in Europe. And here's how it works. You take the cobble now, and from 1 to 2, what you're doing is you're taking a cobble and you're chipping off flakes in a rather systematic way around the edge of the cobble, right? Once you do that, you're prepared now, because you've formed sharp edges there, you are prepared to begin to form a convex surface on the top of the cobble by, in number 3, flaking off bits on the top of the cobble now. And in number 4, that process is completed. And if you do this right, in number 5, you may need one or more other strokes, kinds of hammer strokes. You may need to lop off one end of it, depending upon the shape of the cobble and so on. But if you've done this right, one strike, here represented by the arrow in number 5, will break off a finished point, or at least a point that only needs slight retouching, right? Now think about this as a system of indexes. First of all, it is systematic in a way that the Acheulean biface indexes were not at all systematic. This is not a willy-nilly array of indexes, one following after another in an unpredictable fashion. It is a set of hierarchized different kinds of indexes in regard to the core that you started with that have to be arranged in just this way, or you will not get to the final product. The point will not come off it, as those of us who have tried to do this Levallois technology learn very quickly. It is very, very hard to get this right, but it's quite a sophisticated technology. The fact that all of these indexes are arranged in this hierarchized set of different kinds of indexes that have to be ordered just so in order to get the final product is why I think of this not just as an indexical system, but as a hyper-indexical system. Something has happened here in the ordering of indexes that is decisively different from what happened in the Acheulean hand axe. Okay, what we have now by this time is hominins, several species of hominins. We keep discovering more and more probably, but in just one last week with Homo luzonensis that you may have noticed in the papers. But at this point in the evolution of hominins, we've got a lot of complex semiosis that is going on, that is being transmitted from generation to generation in the culture. We've got cultural systems of some complexity. What is the impact of these cultural systems then on the niche construction, on our second algorithm, on that cultural niche construction we were talking about before? Well, here's a diagram that adds now something down at the bottom that tries to show this. What happens with these cultural systems is that even though they are generated by the overall cycle, the feedback cycle of niche construction in cultural animals, even though they are generated from that cycle, they come to have a holistic quality, first of all, because they have to be passed on. Think of the Levallois technology. It must be passed on as a whole or it doesn't work. Because of this holistic transmission, their integrated nature as a system comes to be more marked in the cultures that practice them. They have an autonomy from the other aspects of the cultural practices of the culture. They have a robustness of systematic integration, perhaps, as well. All of these things form what I call cultural epicycles. They form cultural forces, technologies in this case, cultural forces that kind of come to stand outside of the overall feedback loop of niche construction. Because they are so autonomous in their integrated holism. They come to stand outside of that feedback loop, and they come then to be able to feed forward into the loop and bias it and redirect it and change its direction finally, right? A simple example of this would be the control of fire. One need only think for a minute to think that's a technology. It's a pretty complex technology, probably mastered between 700,000 and 100,000 and a million years ago by hominins, though the dating is again another vexed problem. But nonetheless, think of the control of fire and think of what that would do once there was a systematic control of fire. Think what it would do for in terms of redirecting the niche construction, right? All right, cultural epicycles, redirecting cultural niche construction. Let's look at such an epicycle, the bead making epicycle. Bead making is hugely dispersed in hominin cultures, probably only in Homo sapiens culture, but maybe also in Neanderthal cultures. In any case, in sapient culture, in our own ancestors' cultures and related sapient groups, it goes back at least 100,000 years, probably more like 130,000 years. What archaeologists mean by bead making is to take any small object, a seashell, a fragment of an ostrich eggshell in another instance, a tooth of an animal that has been hunted, a piece of mineral, a piece of amber, take any small object and drill it through or pierce it so as to be hung. So as to be hung on a strap, an anklet, a bracelet, a necklace, so as to be hung on hair, so as to be hung on clothing. Bead making. Why, the mystery about bead making is why does it pop up everywhere Homo sapiens goes, right? In vastly different geographical arenas, vastly different niches, bead making pops up. What is making this epicycle? What is the force that makes this epicycle take shape? For me, it has to do precisely with the complexity of semiotic cognition. What you've got now is early humans who are working with indexes in pretty complicated ways. We see that already in the Levallois point making. But you've also, that complicated semiosis must also be reflected in the complications, the growing complications of the social structures of these groups themselves. What is probably coming on board are new registers of kinship relations, new registers of social status and social power, right? But as these things come on board, as the complexity of the society grows, what is also manifesting itself are invisible realms of culture, so to speak. These are not realms that are necessarily smacking you in the face. You cannot tell that somebody is a kin, especially a distant kin, simply by looking at them, simply by encountering them. This is now something that has become invisible in the practice of culture itself and needs then to be made visible. What could be more easily understood than that these cultures would, all of them, one after another, use their sophisticated technologies so as to construct markers by which social difference could be registered. Now these beads were no doubt not the only social markers. The scarification of the flesh, body painting, tattooing. There may have been many the kinds of clothing that was worn. It's just that bead making is the one that was made with materials that have endured down to our time and can be studied by archaeologists. But it shows us, it seems to me, the way in which a cultural epicycle can become necessary in the growing complexity of the cultural niche construction of a group of humans. It shows us something else too. It shows us, because if we take a group, say, this is a group that has been studied, or at least an instance that has been studied. If we take humans 100,000 years ago in Blombos Cave on the southern edge of South Africa, they've been harvesting shellfish for their food for a long, long time now. For tens of thousands of years, maybe, they've been harvesting shellfish. When they come to be a bead-making culture, using the seashells as their beads, suddenly a new affordance a new resource in the niche has been invented, so to speak, by their cultural practice, right? Seashells are no longer trash to be thrown on the midden. Seashells now have the capacity to become signs of social complexity. So what happens in this epicyclic niche construction is not only the redirecting of the cycle of niche construction, in all kinds of possible directions. But in the course of that redirecting, the uncovering of new resources, perhaps the meeting up against of new constraints in the environment, all kinds of things can happen in terms of the affordances and constraints of the environment. Here's another kind of epicycle. This is a whole class of epicycle, of cultural epicycles as far as I see, and that is ritual. So what is a ritual? Well, first of all, it is behavior that has been systematized. It's repeatable behavior. It's distinct by its systematic organization from everyday activities that don't somehow count as ritual. In all of these features, it begins to look like the holistic systems of cultural epicycles. And like epicycles, it might reshape the affordances and constraints, even by using the materials, materials as a part of its distinct cultural system. It might reshape the affordances and constraints of the environment in the way that I was just saying. The autonomy and robustness of the system might be very, very much marked by the systematized, repeatable nature of it. But there's one new ingredient that we haven't introduced yet that is absolutely basic to ritual, and that is that there's a double systematization at stake here. On the one hand, there are the elements of the ritual that are systematized in relationship to one another. But on the other hand, the relationship between the ritual and the broader culture is systematized as well. You do not have a funerary ritual unless somebody has died. You don't have a puberty ritual unless somebody is passing through puberty. So that double systematization it seems to me crucial in a definition of ritual and in trying to understand the origins of ritual. And it suggests that those origins are very, very ancient origins, in fact. It suggests to me that what we need in a culture for it to practice ritual is hyperindexicality. It is not yet symbolism. You don't have to have language in order to practice ritual. And I think we can see what you do have to have is a performed system of indexes. We've seen performed systems of indexes, after all, in Levallois technology. What you have to have also is the indexical relation of that system to the broader culture, the hyperindexical doubleness I was talking about. All of this brings you to the verge of symbolism, but it doesn't necessarily require symbolism. You don't need language for ritual. This is an idea that is rather foreign to many anthropologists when they think about ritual, but it seems to me that we can look back deep in our deep history and see creatures who were not entirely like us in many, many ways, and yet already had begun to form rudimentary ritual structures in their societies. And one of the ways they were not like us was that they did not yet have modern language. They had proto-languages of indexical sorts, complex, no doubt, in their communicative capacities, but nothing like the full grammar, syntax, and lexicon that makes language the symbolic medium par excellence that it is. Here's an instance of the rather lurid picture this is a representation of a site, Boxgrove, in southern England, that has been excavated and excavated and excavated. It was a stunning site when it was found. What was found on this site was evidence of hominin hunting, apparently, and also butchering then of a rhinoceros, of several horses, a whole system, a cultural system. There was a water hole, you can see that in the picture. I love this kind of picture, by the way, this kind of peaceable kingdom, right, with a twist. All these animals kind of wandering around, kind of, happily sort of looking at them. But nonetheless, whatever is not necessarily what Boxgrove would have looked like 500,000 years ago, some of these things are what this would have looked like at the moment of butchering this rhinoceros. Number one, we know that this person making stone tools were made on the site in order to butcher the rhinoceros. We know where the stones came from. They came from the limestone cliffs at the back. We even have places where cobbles were picked off of the limestone cliffs and tested right there and deemed not worthy of being carried over to the rhinoceros. That too has been analyzed by these archaeologists. This site has just revealed a treasure trove of information. We can imagine then the complexity and the fraught complexity of this scene, which is pictured here as well. You've got some of the humans that need to be warding off the hyenas and the scavengers that are going to be surrounding them. You've got others that are making the stone tools. Some of the food would be consumed immediately on the scene. Some of the food would be lugged away, probably to be cooked. A lot of complexity to this, right? It is not necessarily a ritual scene, and yet we are in a hyperindexical situation that could even easily give rise to ritual, and we are 500,000 years ago. 200,000 years and more before Homo sapiens emerged, 150,000 years or so before Neanderthals emerged, this would have been Homo heidelbergensis in all likelihood, usually taken to be the common ancestor of both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Okay, another review. Again, we look at the pyramid. The fundamental information with its correspondence at the bottom, the semiosis with its aboutness and meaning, the culture with its learning and teaching and transmission, complex cultural systems, epicyclic niche construction is involved there. But notice where I've arrayed the kinds of signs that we talked about at first. Culture can subsist perfectly well with icons and indexes. I don't think cultural animals can subsist with icons alone, but with icons and indexes, culture can emerge. For complex systematic culture, you need at least the hyperindex, as I'm calling it, or perhaps full-fledged symbolism. Of course, my view is you do not need full-fledged symbolism for this cultural complexity to emerge. Hyperindexicality is enough. And indeed, my view is that hyperindexicality lasted a long, long time in Homo sapiens history, and it was only after the 100,000-year mark that modern language fully coalesced. A rather recent coalescing, in other words. And now, again, to think again once more about the way in which epicycles bias niche construction. Here's one more chart. You've got a complex ordered cultural archive. Think of the Levallois technology that I've shown you up in the right-hand corner. This brings about hierarchy, systems, holistic transmission, robustness, autonomy, all these things I've talked about already. Cultural epicycles with their feed-forward bias that changes the course of niche construction. New affordances and constraints that can then be identified and exploited in niche construction, feeding back into a niche that is now going to be constructed in a new and different way. Right? All of this process, it seems to me, is a process that in our deep history began easily by 100,000 years ago, probably longer than that, probably a good deal longer than that, began to open further domains, so to speak, of cultural activity for hominins, not only Homo sapiens, but a wide group of different kinds of hominins, probably. And I want to finish by talking then about some of those new domains. Some of these reach back beyond, farther beyond Homo sapiens. Some of them are sapient in particular, but all of them show the encroaching of this powerful epicyclic niche construction that can simply expand the possibilities of the building of the niche. So here's the first of them, hyperdeveloped technology. Well, this might seem obvious, right? We've talked a lot about technology today. The notion of hyperdeveloped technology as a new domain of niche construction is one that comes on board pretty early. Here's an example. These are a couple of the Schöningen spears, wooden javelins that were unearthed in the 1990s in Germany. Well over 300,000 years old by the most recent and authoritative dating. This is long before Homo sapiens made it in any persistent way in Europe. It is right at the beginning of the Neanderthal history in Europe. These are very, very ancient. They may not look to you like hyperdeveloped technology. However, these javelins, first of all, they are aerodynamically wonderful, number one. Number two, they were carved out of the hardest wood at the bottom of a spruce trunk. This is all being done with stone tools, right? This is extraordinary, an extraordinarily hyperdeveloped technology to get something like this. The fact that these wooden spears were, of course, wood is not very durable in terms of archaeological spans of like 300,000 years. The fact that they were preserved is a small miracle in and of itself. Another hyperdeveloped technology, the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow is now a very, very complicated composite technology. The arrow itself needs feathers at the end. It needs a point that is hafted onto the shaft at the forward end. The bow is another complex composite tool. The recent notions of bow and arrow technology that archaeologists have been putting forward suggest that in Africa this may go back, by some estimates, 500,000 years. That's a pretty large estimate. Most people sort of settle well over 100,000 years ago, somewhere between 100 and 500,000 years ago. We don't have specimens of bows and arrows. All we have are points that seem to have been used to make arrows in some cases. Right? The stone points are the only parts of these that have survived. But the technology for making these points goes back something like 300,000 years or more. Here's the astonishing Gabernmung rock shelter in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia, probably between 28 and 48,000 years ago. I'm not showing it to you for these amazing, amazing paintings all over the ceiling of this naturally eroded away kind of cathedral effect here. I'm showing it to you because we need to pay attention to Australia when we talk about hyper-developed technologies. The latest evidence, which just was published last year, has pretty conclusively settled the date by which Homo sapiens made it to Australia, 60 to 65,000 years ago. This is hugely ancient, first of all, and second of all, they have made it to Australia at a time when, well, there was never a time when Australia was connected to the Indonesian islands by a land bridge, right? At the periods of greatest glaciation, when the sea levels were lowest, there were still something like 70 kilometers of open sea to get across. These people were seafarers in some fashion, and it's utterly astonishing that they could be. We have no record because we have no preserved boats or anything that looks like boat technology from anywhere in the Paleolithic era. It would be wonderful to find it. They were using it. And it might be that Homo luzonensis, announced just last week, was also a seafaring creature from an entirely different lineage than Homo sapiens. That too, there was no land bridge to Luzon, the Philippine island where those fossils were discovered, ever either. All right, further new domains. The release from proximity. This is a great phrase that was introduced by an archaeologist a number of years ago. What it means is the establishment of the offline imaginary or the offline imagination in some way. Think of the capacity of baboons to interact in complex ways socially with one another. It's a very complex sociality, but it's all face-to-face. They interact according to face-to-face transactions. The notion of, the question of when it is that in our hominin evolution, when it is that hominins move beyond that notion into an imaginary that could posit interactions that might come tomorrow, could remember interactions that came yesterday and work on the basis of those, could begin to extend the imagination far beyond the senses. That's what this release from proximity is about. We see it in cave paintings, the very notion of painting this fabulous panel from Grotte Chauvet, the very notion of painting animals on a wall with these iconic patterns of the sort that we talked about with the woolly mammoth at the beginning, when the animals are not there, the animals are outside, is a release from proximity of an extraordinary sort in itself. But much earlier than Grotte Chauvet, we see something like this incised piece of ochre from Blombos Cave in South Africa. More than 70,000 years ago was when it was incised. Incised for what purpose? We don't know, but incised with some sort of intent, clearly. And this was not a haphazard incision that was done. This too has been studied very microscopically. In fact, that there are a number of pieces like this. They've been studied microscopically to understand how they came about. It didn't come about from somebody chopping meat on top of a piece of ochre. It came about because for some reason this ochre had incised in this way could have some meaning beyond its presence as a piece of ochre. I've already talked about beads. Here are some of the shell beads from Blombos Cave, also more than 70,000 years ago. This too is the notion of those invisible aspects of sociality is another case in point of the release from proximity. One of the most famous instances of this, over 40,000 years old, from southwestern Germany, the so-called Löwenmensch, the lion man of Hohenstein-Stadel. This is an extraordinary carved ivory, mammoth ivory, about this tall, of a creature that could never have been seen, for which one had to have a dramatic release from proximity in order to come up with the notion in the first place. Half human or humanoid, bipedal, upright, but with a lion head at the top of it or a feline head at the top of it. So, the release from proximity. The release from proximity is working hand in hand with what I've already talked about, the doubled indexicality of ritual. This complex doubled indexicality is bringing you, as I said before, close to the notion of a full-fledged symbolism. And here, for my illustration, well, I can't resist giving this crazy painting. From 1883, Viktor Vaznetsov, Russian landscape painter, and painted Russian scenes, and every once in a while he indulged himself and painted a Stone Age scene. It's an extraordinary thing, almost like that Peaceable Kingdom we saw a few slides ago. The doubled indexicality of ritual. Hyper-indexicality. What do I mean by hyper-indexicality? Well, you heard at the beginning that I'm a musicologist by trade, and so music had to enter in here at some point. This is a single pipe viewed from several different vantages. Again, constructed from a griffin vulture radius, a wing bone of a griffin vulture. Say ulna? It's an ulna. Goodness. Thank you, Rick. Any bird information, he's the man. He is the man. Thank you, Rick. He's an ulna. In any case, this fantastic pipe, over 40,000 years old, the reason that I call music hyperindexicality is because though music in the modern world, all human music, is absolutely imbricated and tied in with and overlaid on and interweaved with symbolism, it cannot not be, because we are absolutely inveterate, habitual symbolic creatures today in the world. So music is always involved with symbolic acts in modern humanity. But the music itself, in the nature of its construction, musical systems across the world, in the nature of their construction, and in the nature of the cognitive reception of them and processing of them, can be thought of not, in fact, as symbolic at all, but as the most hyper-developed kind of ordered indexes that humans have invented, hence the hyperindexicality. Music is indexical on many different levels at once. Even what music that we would think of as simple music is this, indexical on many different levels at once, different temporal levels, different scales at which things are pointing to one another and indicating one another, indicating things that might or might not come with the next gesture in the music. Hyperindexicality. Full-fledged symbolism, of course, the best example of this is language. Here's a map of language families across the world. And finally, emerging cultural difference / extended niche construction. Why have I linked these two things together? Well, perhaps it is clear from what I've said already. But the human capacity to construct cultural difference had to have emerged in relation to systematic epicyclic niche construction. The systematized epicycles of the niche construction is pointing up new resources, new possibilities. It is then tapping into the behavioral flexibility of these cultural creatures who then devise, according to these new resources, new strategies for niche construction. But by the same token, as they construct new niches, these novel niches are solidifying the differing cultural practices by which they were constructed in the first place. Right? So you've got, from somewhere between 100 and 70,000 years ago, you've got the lineage of humans that populated the whole world that is moving back through Africa, interbreeding with other hominin, other sapient groups that are there already, moving out from Africa and moving across the whole world so quickly that by 65,000 years ago they're already in Australia. You've got all of this happening on the basis of the successive construction of niche after niche after niche that can only come about through the offline imaginary, the complexities of epicyclic niche construction that enables the discovery of new resources at every moment, that then reshapes the whole nature of the niche construction in that circumstance, but that also then forms a solidification of certain kinds of a practice, a set of unfolding cultural differences across the world, given the niches that are constructed, right? And this is one of my favorite maps. It's out of date now in many ways, but it shows a very simplified picture of mitochondrial lineages traced. It is the L1 lineage in Africa. L1 and L2 moved back into Africa. L3 rather moved out of Africa. The M path was the path that went along the southern coast of Asia. The N path went into Central Asia and turned back into Europe with an R path that is not even named here, and so on and so forth, all the way to successive waves that made it all the way to the tip of South America, finally, between, say, 70,000 years ago and, well, the tip of South America, probably something on the order of 15,000 years ago. But the message here is that the populating of the world could only come about by virtue of the diversified cultural niche construction that was made available by systematized semiosis. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. Questions?
We do have a microphone that Ty has, and I'll ask you to use it if you want to ask a question. Can you pass that down, please?
Well, that was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure everyone agrees. So you take us back 500,000 years and kind of up to the verge of modern civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And you have extremely slow development during most of that time compared to what we're used to.
Right, right.
And then in the second half of the last century, you begin to see this incredible hyperization of cultural development, getting faster and faster year by year. And I wonder if you could comment on that trajectory.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, and it is a very real trajectory. I would say only one thing about the trajectory as you've laid it out. I think the newest archaeological evidence suggests that the acceleration is happening almost as much as 100,000 years ago. It is really taking off. It is not suggesting that something unique happened 45,000 years ago in Europe with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. That's deeply out. Because so much African evidence is coming on board now that just in the last 25 years, it is just remaking the whole picture. And the picture now has very, very complicated, I would say the picture now has human modernity taking shape by about 70,000 years ago. In other words, Homo sapiens of at least this L lineage were essentially like us then, if without all kinds of attainments that have come since then. But they were essentially like us. And I'm just waiting for the moment when musical instruments 30,000 years older than that Griffin ulna are found in Africa. I'm convinced that they were doing, given the technologies that are now recorded for them, that they were doing just immensely complicated things. 103,000 years ago, Blombos Cave, they keep digging down and down and down in this cave on the southern African coast. The deeper they get, the older they get, of course. And 103,000 years ago is the level to which they came a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, they got to 103,000 year level, where they found paint pots, in essence, abalone shells that had dried paint mixtures with the stirring sticks there too, right? That's 103,000 years ago. They're painting their bodies, they're painting something, they're doing all kinds of stuff, right? So now that sort of extends your trajectory a little bit farther back. The question of the acceleration is, of course, the real kernel of your question, and it's a very, very interesting thing. I think that burgeoning epicycles explain the acceleration that and I've talked about this a lot in Culture in the Course of Human Evolution, the way in which the production of epicycles could spur not only it's partly that what it spurs is a quickening accumulation of cultural archives, as I tend to call them. That is to say, of the sheer amount of material that is passed along from generation to generation. Now that has something to do, obviously, with cognitive development and all kinds of other things as well. And this is hugely complicated to get at, but it seems to me it also has something to do with the need in a deepening cultural archive to systematize what is transmitted, the function of those systems then in driving forward towards new systems and finally accelerating the whole process. So there's a kind of, I wouldn't call it bootstrapping because that's associated with other views of hominin evolution that I don't quite agree with. It's a term of art that is used for them, but it is like that. It is as if the very process of the formation of these epicycles is one that is going to accelerate the accumulation of more cultural material to form more cultural epicycles. So something along those lines is where I go with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, Günther.
So I'm not sure I understood you correctly, but I perceived as if you were suggesting that cultural differentiation is a relatively late event in your hierarchy. And I'm surprised about this because I think these epicycles that you talk about are in a way arbitrary, right? They are not ecologically necessary. And since they are arbitrary, so cultural differentiation should actually happen as soon as there are epicycles, because different epicycles are likely to arise in different populations. As soon as you have epicycles, there's cultural differentiation.
Yeah. Well,
Did I misunderstand?
so I've put the burgeoning of cultural difference back 70 to 100,000 years, right? It's not that recent, first of all, right? That's the first thing. So I'm stretching it back a little bit farther than that. So the bead making epicycle is a good instance of this. That is to say, and it is an instance of the way in which these cultural epicycles are not, in fact, arbitrary, but depend on the affordance and constraint of a particular environment, right? There is.
But it's arbitrary whether you start using a particular affordance.
It is, again, if you think of the bead making example, it's not entirely arbitrary. If there is a pressure from growing social complexity to mark the complexity somehow, certain things are going to pop up in the cultural practices of a society, and other things are not going to pop up. Those things that do pop up have to do with the capabilities of the humans that are doing them, but they also have to do with the affordance and constraint of the environment, right? So I don't think arbitrariness is the right word for the epicycles as a whole. But I do take your point.
Opportunity, perhaps, right?
Indeed. Opportunity is another word. I mean, this is canalized, to use a word from your neck of the wood in molecular biology, right? This is a canalized kind of cultural development that is part and parcel of the ongoing cycle of niche construction. But your question still remains as to shouldn't difference be popping up as soon as these things happen? And I say yes, it should. Yes, it is. So I didn't mean to say that what I meant to say about recent cultural difference in Homo sapiens is that it is part and parcel of what has enabled the populating of the whole world. On a much more limited scale, humans in northern Germany are making spruce javelins because that's what they need. That's what they've got there, and that's what their technology and their cognition will allow them to do. So that is a kind of cultural difference. The bead making, the differences in bead materials is a kind of cultural difference that comes to be fixed and solidified in cultures. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
I was just wondering, as a general question, is there anything that you have found difficult to explain? Something is
almost everything. Almost everything. Well, it's a good question. But look at this Homo luzonensis announced last week, right? Homo luzonensis is by the preliminary announcement of this. I mean, they've been studying it for years. These fossils were found a while ago, and they only now released this. This is a creature about 4 feet tall that managed to get to the island of Luzon and was active there somewhere between 70 and 50,000 years ago, something on that order, right? It is not Homo sapiens, so it's a different lineage. Now, 1.75 million years ago, there were earlier waves of hominins coming out of Africa. Homo erectus was one big group in Africa that is usually in its Eurasian versions called Homo ergaster, right? So, there was by the way, a second discovery about 20 years ago, which was the Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit of an Indonesian island of Flores, right? These are unexplained. We don't understand how the Homo ergaster lineages continued to develop. We don't understand what kind of technology they might have had across their evolution. There's very, very little hint that they could have had seafaring technology. We don't get that. We don't understand how, to go back to Homo sapiens, how they moved as quickly as they did once they started moving. It seems unlikely, and this is partly judging from climate patterns and so on and so forth, when it would have been easy to get out of Africa and when not and so on. It seems unlikely that Homo sapiens in the final migration out of Africa that did populate the whole world, there were earlier ones that didn't last into the Levant and places like that, but in the final push that populated the whole world, it seems unlikely that began much before 70,000 years ago. But they made it to Australia 5,000 years, as little as 5,000 years later. This is just astonishing. How does this happen, right? And where is the technology for this to happen? And it's one thing after another, one question after another. How do you manage to carve a spruce trunk at the hardest portion of of wood at its base and create such a lovely javelin out of stone tools? Well, clearly you can do all kinds of things with stone tools. We know that, but these are not easy feats, right? So it is all of it astonishing. The achievements of these early humans, not only sapiens, but Neanderthals, the Denisovans, another lineage that was only discovered in the 1990s from southern Siberia. We have, not all of us, but we have bits of Denisovan genes in our gene pool. There was some interbreeding between sapiens and Denisovans. There was a good deal of interbreeding between sapiens and Neanderthals, we now know. But the movements of these things, the movements of these populations, there are waves and waves and waves of them that we don't know about, that we have only the slightest glimmerings of in the technological record. It's all extraordinary. It's an extraordinary history. To me, it's just absolutely fascinating, continues to be fascinating. And my effort then is to propose a model that helps us to understand how some of this mobility, some of this differentiation of how all of it could come about that is not requiring some miracle gene that makes us linguistic creatures, for example, but rather has a different set of biocultural interdependencies that is what spells the changes over several 100,000 years. I don't know whether that helps you very much, but...
Yeah, and if I can, a second question also, since we were...
Hold the mic up further. Hold the mic up.
What is... you talk about it as culture as something that belongs to humans by the nature of semiotics. But I remember watching this feature on PBS about cuttlefish, which turned out to be much more sophisticated than I thought, and the behavior, the mating behavior, and everything else, and offering, was amazingly human.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so how do you dissect what is
culture? Yeah, it's a very good question. The first thing to say is that I didn't restrict culture to humans. I think culture is widespread through a large group of animals in the world today. However, there's a difference between social organization and complexity in ants and social organization and complexity, say, in a group of chimpanzees. And the difference has everything to do with the learning of information that you then transmit to the next generation. Ants don't do that, right? They are genetically programmed to do certain things and interact with one another in certain ways. I think cuttlefish, which are fascinating, cuttlefish have, you did mention cuttlefish, didn't you? Yeah, cuttlefish have as many as 30 to 35 different flashing signs, I once saw a film, an amazing film, of somebody who in a laboratory held an American flag up in front of the thing, and honest to God, it flashed red, white, and blue. I mean, it's just amazing. So they had these extraordinary semiotic capacities in the chromatophores and those are hooked up to neurons in all kinds of complicated ways. I never want to underplay the complexity of cephalopods all told. Octopuses are amazing, squids are amazing, cuttlefish are amazing. Yeah, I don't know that we have any evidence that octopuses, squids, and cuttlefish are cultural animals according to the outlines that I've been talking about here. But we do have evidence that they do very, very complicated things. The latest report I saw was an octopus using a shell as a tool. Tool using octopuses. Who'd have thunk? But it seems, it's extraordinary. Yeah. I will say one more thing about this in answer to this question. The one thing I never want to do in trying to emphasize, I don't think one has to de-emphasize the complexity of other animals in order to emphasize the complexity of humans. That's simply not a dichotomy that is useful to me. Other animals do amazing things.
Oh, yeah.
Ask Rick. He knows. Yeah, go ahead. Francesco.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Besides some technical question we can discuss during the party, there are one point that is important to me. In this wonderful depiction you gave us, some of the passages imply at least two things that are worthy of mentioning. First, there are passages that serve or look at different and opposite goals. For example, the passage on from hyperindexicality to offline is instrumental both to the construction of an archive and the construction of an imagination.
Okay.
And the second is every passage implies also losses.
I didn't hear that. Means?
You lose something.
Yeah, right.
For example, to go offline, it's a dramatic moment in which you lose contact with the reality. Reality goes away, and you need to say goodbye to reality in order to perform a number of semiotic acts. And this is a very dramatic moment in which you are no longer tuned with the reality, and you have to refurbish or relaunch the circle of the entire semiosis in order to fulfill this lack.
yeah. It's tremendously dramatic, Francesco, I agree. But I don't necessarily agree that you, in fact, have to lose reality in order to get this expanded imaginary. So what is happening with humans 40,000 years ago painting a mammoth on the cave wall? There is an exercise of the offline imagination. And it's clear that they're not hunting the mammoth at that moment when they're painting it, right? So maybe that counts as a loss. However, what they are doing is well, I see it more as an expanded reality rather than a loss of touch with reality, right? What they are doing is expanding the reality so that something is brought into the cave with a presence that it hadn't had in the cave before, all right? And that so I would only disagree with the question with the vocabulary of loss at that moment.
They killed the animals.
They
killed the animals.
Well, sure.
Yeah, and the animals disappeared. So there is this ritual also is an attempt of restoration.
Well, when they were painting these animals on the walls, they hadn't killed them all off, right? There were plenty of woolly mammoths outside the cave when they were painting these pictures, right? We know that's for a fact. I'm not saying you don't have to agree. It is simply true, right? So yes, but these were animals that these humans hunted. They were animals that they interacted with in all the complex ways that such complex parts of niche construction would interact with one another. To expand the horizon of that niche construction so that they are brought into the cave is very, very dramatic, as you say. Yeah, absolutely dramatic, and suggests. Well, it suggests. Among other things, it suggests to me the double indexicality of ritual at work, right? It suggests something like that, yeah.
So I have a very quick question before we close. So where does intentionality fit in?
Oh, it's right at the heart of it. Okay. I mean, by which you mean the philosopher's intentionality, not my intent to do something. Yeah, indeed. Intentionality is in fact a question of aboutness, right? It is about a mind directed to something. My notion of semiosis is about minds that are directed in that notion of attention as opposed to intention. But it seems to me, attention that is going to be a foundation for intentionality. So intentionality then is a useful philosopher's term. It's a very important one, obviously. Lots of philosophers talk about it. But it is one that is fixed on human states of mind. And the reason that I don't use the term is precisely to get away from that. Yeah. But it is related, yeah.
So Gary, thanks so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.